screen. Can you all see the screen?
Yeah.
Great. Good morning, everyone tuning in from Facebook and joining us on the Zoom right now. Welcome to our second session of the Interconnected Justice series at URI North America. My name is Tahil Sharma, and I am the regional coordinator for the region, and I'm very excited to be having this dialogue today. For those of you that are tuning in to URI for the first time, you might be wondering what our organization is about. We are a movement of cooperation circles or chapter organizations around the world that are looking to make interfaith cooperation a daily routine by striving for cultures of peace, justice, and healing. These communities are autonomous organizations and groups that are looking to fix their local contexts and solutions when it comes to the work of interfaith cooperation and justice. And I'm very excited to be in a region with over 90 cooperation circles in a network of over 1,110 countries. And I'm excited to invite you to this second session of the Interconnected Justice Workshop series, where we'll be focusing on justice through dialogue. So we have a couple of community rules for this session, and it's because we're focusing on the idea of dialogue and its importance. These rules are very simple and straightforward. If anyone has any questions, they're more than happy to add them in the chat box below. But in the meantime, we just want to let people know that these parameters are helpful for us to be able to have a space where everyone is on equal footing and able to bring in all of their identities. So first, making sure you speak in I statements. You may be representing all sorts of different communities as you come into this space, but that doesn't mean you're the representative at all times. So you are going to be the best expert at yourself, and therefore it is important that you share that perspective and that full identity as you come into this space. Secondly, this is a space for sharing and learning. You own your own story and not the story of others. So make sure you give yourself the opportunity to share, but be mindful that other people in this space are here to share as well. Try not to take up all the time in speaking, and give yourself the opportunity to share. And this is also a safe space and a brave space for sharing. We are broadcasting on Facebook Live right now, but this is a space to remember that we are here to share our perspectives, our experiences, and our values. And we are willing to challenge each other on certain points of how we understand the world, how we understand issues, and how we can come to better conclusions and a consensus about topics that matter. So we want to make sure that this space is open for everyone to be able to contribute. But as sort of setting up this conversation today, it's going to look a little different. I'm very happy to have folks like Michelle. How do you pronounce your last name, just to confirm?
It's Kosh.
Kosh, okay.
Kosh.
Michelle Kosh. Michelle Kosh is the executive director of the Muslim-Jewish Solidarity Committee. And oh, Peter, I'm so sorry. I just realized your name is not supposed to be like that. But that's a good reason for me to probably stop sharing screen. Peter Wilner is one of the program officers for the El Hindi Dialogue Center at InterfaithWorks in New York. Along with Michelle Kosh, whose Muslim-Jewish Solidarity Committee is also based in New York. And these were sort of the two perfect folks that I thought would be a part of this conversation today. So I'm very thankful and excited to have you. And let's just start and take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tahil, and it's such a pleasure to be asked to be here. So it's just, I want to say just greetings to everyone, and thank you for taking the time. And I think I'm looking forward to this being less of a conversation between Michelle and I, and really more of a conversation between Tahil Michelle and I. So I don't know, Michelle, if you want to add anything before we get started.
Yes, just thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to be here.
Great. Please.
Yeah, so I guess, Michelle, if I could ask, I'm really curious about just the name and nature of the work that you do at your organization. I just wondered, would you mind sharing about what it is and what you do?
Sure. So the Muslim Jewish Solidarity Committee was founded in 2015. It was not planned to be an organization. It was more of a reaction to a lot of toxicity that was going on at this time. There was there was a war going on in Gaza between Israel and the Palestinians, and there was just a lot of toxic stuff going on social media. And we felt like we want to come together. There was no real plan of why, what, how. Just let's get together. And at the beginning, it was very small gatherings of maybe a dozen people. And, at some point we've had Ramadan came, actually, we had an iftar that ended up being very successful. It was held at a synagogue. We called it iftar in a synagogue. 150 people showed up, and after that, added programs. A lot of people joined, became a nonprofit 501c3. Since then, it's been 5-6 years, engaged over 5,000 people in New York City in our activities. Now we're obviously online, so people are joining from all over the world. And that's the story in a nutshell, how this developed, what we tell, and fundraisers and stuff like that. But the real story, I guess, is that we came together because we had this urge to create dialogue. And that's been an evolving story, because what kind of dialogue we really needed is yet to be determined. There's all kinds. Who is our audience? Who do we want to engage? Who are we inviting to the table? Who needs this? What are we exploring in this dialogue? That's something that we've experimented with, struggled with since the very beginning. There were a lot of successes, there were a lot of failures, and it's been going on in different ways. But it is always been very grassrootsy, community oriented. And I guess that's a good point to turn to you, Pete, because you go that extra step to take that conversation a little deeper and more challenging, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. And just really quickly, InterfaithWorks. We're a nonprofit based in Syracuse, New York. We're in our 45th year. We were formed out of a group of faith leaders in this area who had been part of the civil rights movement. And we have 4 major programs. I'm with one of those programs. But we do refugee resettlement in Syracuse through our Center for New Americans. We have a senior services program that addresses the issue of elder isolation. We have a Interfaith Initiatives program that is largely a multi-faith chaplaincy program in jails, hospitals, and nursing homes. And then last but not least, we have the department that I work in, which is called the El Hindi Center for Dialogue. And we're actually in our 25th year this year. We're considered to be one of the longest continually running programs addressing race and racism and stereotyping in the country. And so we have a small little department, but we, in a COVID year last year, we had nearly 1,000 people who went through our dialogue programs on race, racism, ethnicity. In a non-COVID year, we'd have anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 people going through our programs. And one of the wonderful aspects of being in an environment like this, rather than in person, is we've seen our program expand across New York State because of our ability to work remotely and to kind of touch people in this virtual space. And one of the things that I have found is in the transition from doing in-person work to doing virtual work is that a conversation about race and racism is really just that. Whether you're in this space or whether you're in person, they can be very difficult and challenging and courageous waters to try to navigate. So a little bit about us, but that topic of that Michelle alluded to about dialogue, that is what we do. That's all we do. We've done dialogues, not only on race, but we've done them on with interfaith groups. And, I remember quite fondly, starting in 2016, we actually worked with URI CCs. And we did, we actually were in this platform. Who would have known in 2016 we'd be living in this platform, but we were doing a learning community, and that was with Sari Heidenreich, who some of you may have known. And it was restoring relationships after the election. And that went from 2016 through just about to 2018. And so that's a little bit of the experience that we've had too around that.
Great. And it's so awesome to hear the, unique ways in which both of you are engaging with communities on the ground, and how that approach continues to be a part of the narrative and the framework that we're trying to engage here at the United Religions Initiative, which is to make sure that grassroots organizations are not only just being uplifted and amplified, but that they're looking to their fellow colleagues to make sure that they can have support, that they can work together to actually really make a robust network of organizations. So one thing that's become very clear, that's relevant to this week actually, is this idea of dealing with polarization. We are coming into this space following the attack that took place on Tuesday of some Asian American community members in Atlanta, and it's becoming clear that the sentiments of anti-Asian hatred, but also of xenophobia, seem to still be at the center of what we talk about when it comes to bridging communities. And both of you come into that conversation in pretty different ways. Michelle, the work that you do at the Solidarity Committee between Muslims and Jews is usually a part of a larger conversation on how the communities have had relationships together, especially in the American context. And Peter, in your dialogue spaces, it's very much about, dealing with the difficult issues on the ground that, for centuries have been a part of, a very destructive history, but also a part of a new journey going forward. So when we enter conversations like this, what does it mean to be able to address this idea of, tolerance and acceptance in a space where oftentimes emotions can really flare up?
That's a good question. Michelle, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, I was talking before about, our kind of journey of figuring out what is the dialogue that we want to have. And it started very, very careful. It was just really based that there was some research that said that a 10-minute conversation can reduce bias, something like that. And that was kind of like that's what we built from. Every event we had was about just getting to know each other a little bit, but it wasn't, we had facilitated conversations, like we'd always have a theme and there would be prepared materials. We didn't have trained facilitators or anything. It was always very much about community and just kind of creating some fellowship and sharing something about myself that you might be curious about, getting to know each other. And so it was very safe like that. We were inspired to get together because the polarization that happened after, the Israeli-Palestinian, that's still going on, but it was very heated in the summer of 2014, but we didn't touch on that. That's not a topic we discussed. We just figured we need to kind of get to know each other as humans and be in community together. Yeah, so that was just our very, that's the way we started these conversations, you know, and slowly, and it was always open to everybody, you know, trying to be inclusive of all ages, all, you know. So it was always you know, just kind of trying to build this community. That was like our first area of focus, you know, community building, and then slowly we started adding maybe more challenging things. We started getting to some active listening workshops to see what happens if something, you know, that has a little more tension in it comes up. You know, how do we, all kinds of conflict resolution workshops offering that, but the conversations really focus on getting to know each other.
I would add to that you know, I think there are elements of method that we use in common with what Michelle talked about. You know, the dialogue process that we use is really not quite a synonym for a conversation like what we're having now, but it's more of dialogue with a capital D. It's a process by which we can explore and examine issues that can be really difficult and really challenging and emotional. You know, like talking about ethnicity, talking about racism. We start to get to know each other, like Michelle talked about, and we begin to explore things. You know, who are we? What are our identities? How do we see ourselves? As a prelude to begin, how do we start to see others, and how do we start to share stories with each other and hear and learn about our experiences in a way that we can be constructive moving forward towards action. And anymore, you know, for the last 3 years, we really are using a dialogue to action program where we're typically taking small groups of people, maybe 8 to 12, going through a 6-session dialogue of 2 hours per session. And, you know, those middle sessions are normally a deep dive into what do we think about racism? How do we approach it based on the racial or ethnic identities that we have, but not getting stuck in those emotions, trying to recognize them, trying to see them, trying to hear them. But how do we work towards equity planning in a way that, you know, that's within our spheres of control? So how can we identify actions that we can do to begin to address this? The other thing I would say to Heal about your question is, you know, it makes me, you know, the time we're in now makes me think about how like race and racism especially is like an amoeba, you know, that, you know, it has tentacles that reach out and affects people in many different ways, you know, and you know, I think about, you know, particularly now how awful it has been for, you know, Pan-Asian people in our country, especially, and probably, you know, more over in the world, especially with linkages to COVID. And I think, you know, fears for that community that exist that may have been present at different points in time, but are definitely coming into sharp focus now. It makes me think about, you know, September 11th and, you know, and how racism, you know, really jumped out around, you know, our Muslim communities here, you know, and there's just been so many other experiences like that. It makes me think about how, you know, it's not all that unusual in a really sad way to see how race and racism can affect our Pan-Asian communities. You know, it's not just now, but it's, you know, I think a lot about the internment that happened in World War II, you know, that I never obviously ever experienced that, but then, you know, there were earlier laws around, you know, people, you know, new Chinese immigrants to this country. So, you know, I just think about how that's not just an amoeba process, like on a 2-dimensional scale, but it's almost 3-dimensional as it happens over time as well. And so it's always a hard thing to experience and see, but how can we build understanding around different different experiences and really, really work towards meaningful change for us in the communities in which we live. So.
Right. And that's a good point. I was mentioning, how we started with getting to know each other, and a lot of, our events were revolved around food, and, there's a holiday and we're discussing some holiday traditions and stuff like that. But it's really, you have to at some point start acknowledging what other people are carrying in the Muslim community, obviously, since 9/11 has been carrying a lot of trauma. And that's stuff that we needed to start addressing, and it's a struggle how deep you go into that conversation, who's ready for that conversation. But it's a very important to address the trauma in the conversation and what experiences people are carrying.
Yeah. And I'm just so curious, Michelle, because we had a dialogue circle that we were doing around race and ethnicity recently, and it was really, really interesting because we had a participant who identified as Jewish, and in going through this process, this dialogue participant realized for the first time that his or her, I'm going to try to be very, very confidential. I'm always trying to be confidential about participants. That this person's identity the predominant identity was being Jewish, and this was the first time that they had begun to think about themselves as being both Jewish and white, and so it was both a difficult and challenging moment, but a moment of when you can begin to see someone's eyes begin to open around and the growth that might happen from that, but it still is a difficult moment. And I was just wondering, in the line of your work, do you ever, what's your experience with that? Is this uncommon? Is it common?
That's a huge conversation in the Jewish community. I mean, in general, we're bringing Muslims together. We're not. There's a lot of diversity within the communities that we need to acknowledge, and if we're addressing the Jewish community, you have the stigma of the Jews with the, cream cheese bagel lox, that's Ashkenazi Jews came from Europe. We have Jews of color, we have, Jews from Middle Eastern countries. And they have their stories and experiences. There's a lot of, the Jewish identity is layered, and Ashkenazi Jews, I'm Ashkenazi Jew. There's the trauma of the Holocaust. There's my grandparents who went through that, who lost people that I grew up with. But, if I'm on the street in New York and there's a situation with the cops, I'm white, it's a very multi-layered identity within the communities there.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess the other thing to heal, I would love to have your perspective in this conversation, around having people of different faith backgrounds. So I was curious too around, we've had a dialogue recently, and when we have our dialogues, we have people from, really all over the world. It adds such richness to our discussions. But I've heard India described as, I've had colleagues of mine who are from India who say that, the caste system is a 2,000-year-old system of racism. And then I've also heard it described by people from India as being, the caste system as being nothing more than marriage and food. And it strikes me, those are very, very, very different perspectives on a single thing. And I'm wondering, do you have any wisdom or insight into that kind of perspective?
Absolutely, Pete. Of course, again, not another easy topic to talk about, considering that Hindus don't exist in a monolith. With a billion Hindus comes a billion different types of Hinduism. And that can be a really complex challenge when it comes to dealing with, a sort of an institution that is de facto, that, is not a part of the rule book of every Hindu, but has become a part of a social norm and process for many Hindus in the subcontinent, and even when people travel outside of India. And as someone who comes from the privilege of being a Brahmin, but also being someone that is actively, involved in trying to dissolve the caste system, it's become very clear that a system that sort of exists on the backs and at the expense of folks that are not allowed to leave the system, not allowed to interact with others, not allowed to communicate in ways that make them feel like they're fully human, not allowing them to go to temples, not allowing them to be able to find success and stability in the world. That kind of a system, in my opinion, is inherently antithetical to the Hinduism that I was raised up with, which is supposed to be a culture of nonviolence, which is supposed to be pluralistic, which is supposed to be loving and just. And those things are not what I got exposed to when I was taught about the caste system in my own family. I come from a Brahmin family, and they told me you should be proud of being Brahmin. But no one ever explained why. I was given a privilege that I had no connection to whatsoever because I was born in the United States. My family being in India, being used to this system, was very happy and willing to tell me why it was, something important for us to feel above everyone else. But they didn't really justify the, sometimes misogynistic, sometimes dehumanizing behavior to people who were from other castes. And that makes me really think about, this idea of how we work with different privileges depending on the spaces that we're in. I have a privilege as a man. In some spaces, I have a privilege as a Brahmin. And if I don't learn to really relinquish the power of those privileges to equalize the field of dialogue, but also the field of justice itself, I don't know if I'm really, honoring the space that I need to. And I feel like we have to keep living into and inviting ourselves to think about where are those privileges that we come from if we're trying to make sure that marginalized and oppressed communities feel welcome and willing to engage in the space itself.
Interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. And I was, I'm reflecting on that latter point you said, Tahil, and I'm wondering, one of the things that we do in our dialogue process that I don't know, maybe if it's appropriate if I could share my screen. You got me thinking when you're talking about like trying to understand privilege, what you may be aware of, what you may not be aware of. One of the things that we've found really, really helpful in terms of how we can help groups to begin to see that and understand that is we use something that's called the social identity wheel. And I hope everyone can see that. I'll try to get it so it shows up on the screen. Can everyone see what I'm sharing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, this is adapted from the University of Arizona. It's available. You can find a social identity wheel just by Googling it, and there's lots of examples, and there are different ones. But what's so interesting about this is you use this is really a tool to help you begin to pinpoint like the complicated identities that make up all of us. And you do that around here. You fill this in. If I were filling in race and ethnicity, I'd enter in German and Norwegian. If I would enter in my race, I'd enter in white, et cetera, et cetera. And then where the tool comes in is, what do we think about most? What are the identities we think about most? And what do we think about least? And the questions we always ask are why? Why do you think these are things you think about least? And then as we start talking with people, as we start kind of debriefing, we always do this, by the way, in pairs. So we have very small groups do it before we have a big group conversation. And And the other thing I would say too is that when we have people in their pairs discuss, we say that these categories around the circle, they don't have to share them if they don't want to, right? We don't want people, you know, to express something that maybe they have discomfort in expressing. The key element are the questions in the middle. And the really, really important one is, what do you think about least often? And as we do this activity, it's why is it important to think about things that you think least about? You know, why does that become important? And that you know, opens up some space, whether you're a high school student who we work with, or whether you're at a college or university who we work with, whether you're in a nonprofit or business or corporation, or you're just in the community. It gives you conscious thought to privilege. You know, that's what we hope people identify for themselves. Not that we're teaching that, but we hope they begin to see that, you know, if we're not thinking about, you know, gender or sexual orientation or some form of ability, that we might miss that in terms of how we operate and move in the world, that can be painful for people. So how do we approach that in a way where it's not about blame? It's, you know, I do that all the time. So I use this as a tool to help me think about what am I missing, and where do I need to kind of hone in my thinking so I do my best to not miss it. So you had made me think about that, to heal around, like something we use in a dialogue and as a tool.
Yeah, and you know, it can be a part of this, you know, process of trying to build bridges between communities, right? I know that I can't check any part of myself at the door if I'm going to be engaging in dialogue with someone. And it can be a challenge to, you know, acknowledge that, especially when some people, you know, create parameters that say that, oh, if you have any of these views, there's no point in having the conversation. Or they're willing to stick to the soft types of interfaith, which are the dialogue and the eating and the getting along, that they're not willing to get to the harder points of wanting to address more difficult and uncomfortable conversations. And that kind of leaves things in a strange place, right? Like, at what point do we start, you know, saying that yes, we want to get along with our partners and our colleagues, but how far are we willing to go to actually say, like, and that includes talking about things that we, you know, obviously get into disagreement about.
Yeah, we actually had a situation yesterday. We have a program called Scriptural Reasoning. I don't know if anybody is aware of what that is. It's when you take a theme, like yesterday we had Exodus, and we found texts from the Quran, the Hebrew Bible, and the Christian scriptures. All texts refer to the Exodus, and then you have discussions of each text for like 20 minutes, just that text. And it's a wonderful program. You know, it's a very easy way to connect and really get to know each other. It's a very safe kind of environment. But sometimes things are in these texts that make people uncomfortable, you know. And yesterday there was some situation that maybe some participants were offended. They thought that another text is hinting at anti-Semitism, and then it's kind of hard. Like, what do you do? You know, we were discussing that after. How do you solve this? And one person said, "Hey, well, we have to analyze and explain, and the text doesn't really mean this." And if you know, but do you want to get there? I mean, is this point to come to an agreement? And if we leaving, you know, our ego and, you know, ourselves at the door and coming in just open to conversation, and how do we do that? I mean, how is the facilitator going to convince people to that disagreement is fine? You know, it's a very tricky situation, and it's kind of something that we left with an open question. You know, how are we going to engage with participants next time the this arises.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that's like such an important point to raise, Michelle. Like how does that happen? And I'm going to share my screen again. You just made me think about something, Michelle. One of the other tools that we use, and we use it really early on in our dialogue process, is just helping people understand what do we mean by dialogue? How can we lay out what that is? And we juxtapose it with debate. Because, I think in a lot of ways, without knowing it, we probably practice both, right? But if we're actually really trying to explore difficult and challenging topics, we find it's really helpful to have time to really just give thought to it, and when we do this, we actually, maybe I could even model once that what we do. So Michelle, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to read the first debate box, and then if you could read the corresponding dialogue box. So what we do in a session is the co-facilitators will actually go, so debate assumes that there's a right answer and that I have it. And then Michelle, as a co-facilitator, you would then, if you could actually do that next one.
And then dialogue assumes that many people have pieces of the answer and that together they can craft the solution.
And then we go back and forth and we actually read through it. And we're reading through it because, I think even in a space like this, we want to be mindful of things like technological equity, so just because I'm sharing my screen, it doesn't mean that people are going to be able to readily see it. They may be accessing by different devices. There may be bandwidth challenges. So as much as we can, we try to do different types of engagements so that even if someone's listening, they can at least hear. And this is such an important thing to kind of set. And, a lot of times for me, I like to highlight the one I just highlighted here. I reveal my assumptions for reevaluation, which is hopefully if we go into a dialogue process, we can begin to think about how other perspectives can strengthen my own, not necessarily serve as critique, right? I'm defending my assumptions as truth, but how we can go into the space setting like the expectation that we're here to learn and grow. And I think what we've found actually as an agency is sometimes we have dialogues that are more challenging than others. And sometimes we've taken that dialogue and debate chart, which is from this awesome book, by the way, Magic of Dialogue. And we've put it on poster board, and we've shared it. If the dialogues are particularly challenging and people kind of tend to go into that debate category too easily, we always make sure we have space to kind of reset and begin to rethink about dialogue as a fundamentally different process. And it's not to say debate is bad. I think debate has value and debate has use. But if we're really trying to explore hard issues, difficult issues, we need to have a different methodology in place.
So I actually have a bit of a question, I think, going back to Michelle, what you were talking about in what you faced in the session yesterday. Scriptural reasoning is definitely a space where people might feel more comfortable because they're getting to share about their faith perspective, their scriptures, whatever understandings that they have of it. And when talking about something like the Exodus, which, historically has been a part of the Abrahamic traditions as a key part of how we understand some major stories and moral themes and stuff like that. So how did you go to addressing, the folks that were feeling offended by some of the things that were said that might have been anti-Semitic? And what lessons does that provide us when, oftentimes we come into a space with either misunderstanding or with assumptions, and how do we further address them in a way that makes it, more productive in the dialogue rather than destructive and debate-based?
It's a good question. I mean, we we didn't really address it yesterday because it all happened in breakout rooms, and we heard that when the facilitators were reporting after. So the question is how we address it, in the future. It's hard because I don't even know if it's dialogue, it's like it's historical trauma that, somebody's carrying, and how do you address that? How do you enter the dialogue even, it's not even how do you participate in a dialogue? How do you prepare yourself to enter the dialogue? And I think that's why we've been, going back and forth with what we are going to focus our dialogue on, because we want everybody to feel comfortable coming to these kind of sessions. We think that, with all the polarization that's happening in the country, it's really, we don't want to preach to the choir. We want people who are very uncomfortable with talking to other communities. We want them there, so we have to create spaces that they feel comfortable entering, It's a good question, though. It's something that came up yesterday, and I don't have the answer, to be honest. How do we do that? How do we, when we go through these texts and some people get offended, what do you do? How do you, and then that's the question for Pete, he's the trainer here. That's why we start in baby steps, just talking about, real easy things to talk about to make it easy to come out of your comfort zone and kind of just get to know each other a little bit. We've had pre-pandemic, one of our greatest hits, our flagship event, Passover in a mosque. And that was always something sold out way in advance. Everybody just having the Passover Seder on the carpet, in the mosque, and incorporating the Exodus story from the Quran into the Haggadah. It was always a very, very, very special experience. And that's easy to come to, and there were people there, somebody came and whispered to me, I never thought Muslims would let us into a mosque to do this. Somebody who really didn't engage in dialogue before. And for him, this was a good reason to enter a mosque. It was his first time in a mosque. This was a good reason. Oh, they're having Passover for us, It was a big, huge deal for him. So we feel like we need to meet people where they're at, and kind of make it a safe space for them. What happens when we get to something like this now that we're developing the conversation? I would love advice from Pete.
I don't know. It sounds like you're
music teacher in my background. I'm just a community organizer that became involved in this.
Well, I think you're doing a lot of the right things. I mean, meeting people where they're at, trying to create a safe space. I mean, there's one of the things we like to say about facilitation is that you're a sacred container for the conversation, right? And so that's different to think that you're like a cup, right? And that the content is what's going on inside, right? So that the facilitator isn't the teacher. The facilitator is like the guide, and you're the guide in part because if the group ever gets into a difficult situation, like they're talking about difficult things, you're there to help them figure out how do they solve it, right? You're not the problem solver for them. You're there to help them see that they can solve the problems themselves. I think a lot about. We had an experience, and it's so interesting to think that we were doing in-person dialogues 2 days before the quarantine hit last year. I've been thinking about that because we're right at that anniversary, I think, aren't we? It's like it's March
We
19th.
just passed it, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think for us it was March 19th or 20th. You know, and so, you know, we were doing a dialogue, and we had a non-white participant, actually, to go all the way back to what Tehil said earlier to start this, who shared a racist meme about, you know, a Chinese person in COVID. And we had people in our dialogue circle who laughed. Other people were very quiet. And, you know, and so what did my co-facilitator and I do? We had to take a breath, but we had to let them talk, because the idea isn't to intervene in that. It's can the group recognize there's an issue and begin to address it themselves. And it's not to say my co-facilitator and I weren't coming up with a backup plan. We definitely were. But after about 5 minutes, and it was a long 5 minutes, somebody said, is this something we should be laughing at? And it was there, as soon as that person said that, the group turned and began to talk about that was something that group actually shouldn't be laughing at, but they did it themselves. And, you know, I think that's an example of what facilitation is that if you can't, you have to hold the tension that exists in that room. And there was definitely tension. And as soon as someone can feel comfortable enough to say, should we be laughing at that? Then the conversation turned and they began to work through the issue. But, you know, I think what we see so many times is that we want to come over the top of that and intervene, right? It's built into many of us, maybe not all of us, but built into many of us, where we want to stop it. But if we're trying to empower people to stop it themselves, how do we give them the ability to do that? It's not to say as a facilitator, we don't have a plan in place to try to address that. But I think that's what some of those things mean about being a sacred container. We have ground rules, right? We have group agreements that get set about how do we have a good conversation among us. But, you know, the other thing it makes me think about too is that, you know, that we don't grow unless there's conflict. And so that was a moment of conflict. But the facilitator doesn't just, we don't diffuse it and move on. How do we monitor and observe it so it doesn't become harmful? You know, I don't think that example would have come up. There was no one of Pan-Asian descent in the group. And I believe that's why that example was raised. And so, you know, it became a teaching moment, but it was a teaching moment for the group to figure out if it was a teaching moment or not. And so the other thing I think a lot about is, you know, another great facilitator that I know said the job of the facilitator is to disappear. And it's not that you slowly get off screen, but your job is to let the group do work, and you're there on the outside monitoring that work as they do it.
I love that.
Yeah, there's a lot to take away from that. And I think, you know, even to your example, Michelle, of, you know, you literally being put into a situation that you didn't intend for, and then realizing, I don't know how to fix this, or I don't know how to address this situation. The issue that we still have of I don't know in dialogue spaces is super fascinating to me, because even if you're the biggest expert on an issue or a topic, you don't know everything about the issue or the topic. And it's not fair for folks that are trying to engage genuinely in a dialogue to have them know everything to every I dotted and T crossed. I think it's not fair to be able to engage in a conversation where you're not allowed to say, I don't know. Because oftentimes that can be the challenge for having a productive dialogue. Everyone is just expected to come in as the expert on everything, and therefore that's where you see the transition from a dialogue to a debate, because then it becomes about what you know rather than being in the position at that moment in time and how you're addressing the person accordingly. And that just means, like, there needs to be a who, what, where, when, why, and how of how we have dialogue. Who are you talking to? Why are you talking to them? How should you be talking to them? What are you talking to them about? How are you talking to them about it? And that's probably the ways that we can really think about where things can really step into a more, like, meaningful space of engage, rather than one that's always, assumed to be apprehensive, or assumed to be, someone needs to win the conversation for it to be done. um, and Peter, I think to the example that you brought up, I think that's a very important reason why representation matters, right? It's, you're talking about a community or an instance where a community is being discussed, and the community is not there to be able to share their perspective. That is really difficult to deal with. And you, as a person that might be an ally to a community, or you as a person that might be speaking up on a specific issue, like, you can't go representing the community without their consent, or without making sure that you're actually sharing the sentiments and the views of the community. And that can just pose a really major challenge a lot of the times. I can't remember the number of times where I've had to, speak up for Muslim communities against Islamophobia, and there was no Muslim there. I've spoken up against anti-Semitism, and there were no Jews in the room. And there's a certain point where I don't feel comfortable, or that I have the authority to speak for a community, because they're not there speaking for themselves. And circumstances become such where you're like, you don't know what else to do. Either you leave the situation alone and you back off, or you jump right in and you're the one that sinks in the process. And that can always be a really interesting exchange.
Yeah, you make me think a lot about like I really try to, as best, I really try to not operate from a framework of cultural competence. I really try to operate from a framework of cultural humility. And so, I know myself best, but when I talk to people, when I hear people, when I hear what, you, Tahil, and you, Michelle, have said, it helps me understand, and a little more than what I did prior to this call. And, that if I'm ever in situations where, people of your backgrounds aren't, I can use that to, and, along with a cultural humility framework where I'm never going to be an expert really in anyone's experience, but you can take an approach of inquiry and curiosity about, why do you think that? Why do you say that? And, oh, I wonder what, I wonder how it would be taken this way, and which was our backup plan for the example that I gave earlier. I wonder how it would be taken if it were this circumstance. Let's take that exact same thing and put it into a different context, and and see if there are parallels, or I think in facilitation, if there aren't, right? It's okay to have a divergent view, but I don't know if Michelle wants to layer onto that.
No, I think you said all the and
So one sort of last question before, we can lead into a bit more of like breaking down what we've discussed, and where we want to invite people in the space to be able to engage too, is what happens when you are asked to, be inclusive, or be tolerant to a point of no return. There's often this critique of, interfaith spaces that, like, oh, they like to preach tolerance and inclusion, but we don't meet the needs of every community that has a different definition of what is tolerance and what is inclusion. How far do we go when we engage in these kinds of conversations, where there are lines that we kind of draw in the sand of, like, okay, we're tolerant, but we're not that tolerant, or we're inclusive, but we're probably not that inclusive. Do either of you share any thoughts or perspectives on that?
We had a campaign called Love Not Tolerance.
That's a good approach.
Yeah. Pete? Oh.
Well, I think that is a good approach. I think it's, I find it so interesting because what I see happens is I think people have an inclination sometimes to create examples of ways to kind of put pressure on that concept of inclusion that takes it to an extreme that really those examples, I don't know how much of a real world they are. They become like a hypothetical, but it's hard for me to imagine them ever happening. Like, we had a situation where a dialogue group was, there was actually a situation where it involved a person who was Jewish. And they were talking about issues of like diversity and inclusion. And a colleague of theirs had said, well, but the logical conclusion is that if a neo-Nazi were to apply here, that we would hire them. And in a lot of ways, I think that actually that takes the idea about diversity and inclusion and creates a false comparison. In all honesty, it's I don't think I've ever known anyone to do that. It's out of my experience, and I think the idea about someone who is known to apply to a job who identifies that way it just strikes me as being so unlikely. That they would walk in with that identity into a job application, and it also, I think, gets into areas around do we just hire anybody for anything no matter what? And I don't think any of those things are true. So it actually, I think, it actually shifted the conversation it in a way that wasn't helpful, because I don't think it was a situation that this person or this company really ever meaningfully faced. And so it was a non-example. And it was actually it ended up being very hurtful to the person who raised it. And we actually did an empathy building exercise as a result, because it was said to somebody who was Jewish. And how could it be anything other than hurtful? So it had it ended up being like a false comparison, but also a hurtful one at that. And the empathy building activity was around, if you, in the future, if you heard this come up in this person's presence, what are things that you think you could do? And so we tried to say, let's say this happens again, what are things you could do in the future to be an ally? So
I think to the point where when people bring up extreme examples, I kind of find it funny and I kind of find it irritating, because when you're trying to be inclusive as a general concept, people like to take it to the extremities or the fringes, as if it immediately assumes that there's going to be a slippery slide there. It happens on so many different occasions with so many different issues. And it makes me think about this idea called the paradox of tolerance, which is an inherent idea where if you are working to, express this idea of tolerance as a general concept, it doesn't actually mean you are tolerant of everything. You actually have to be intolerant to some things in that process, because there are some things that will be completely antithetical or completely opposing to the views that you're trying to create in a space or a community. And to the point about, we're just going to hire a neo-Nazi to work at our law firm, is not a common thing that is going to be, brought into a conversation, because if there is an ethical framework for an organization that has space for that, is very different from the general society and how it would approach a general topic like that. First of all, as you were saying, when will there be a time where in a space where there might be folks from the Jewish community, while there may be people of color, while there may be LGBTQ people, that suddenly someone is going to have enough of an audacity to apply with that kind of identity and think they're going to get the job, first of all. Second of all, how are we, measuring this idea of tolerance when we know that folks who are usually antithetical to our ideas of diversity, inclusion, and equity and justice won't even think a first thought about engaging with us in a productive way? So it's kind of, it's a form of gaslighting in a way to assume that you are creating a space of inclusion and therefore it has to mean everything. There cannot be a defined standard for what that inclusion or tolerance looks like. And it's not fair to the community that needs the space to be able to connect with others, even with folks that might be different from them. But two, it's also a reminder that the community defines what those parameters are. It's not just a loose set of rules that can be changed on a daily basis. Yes, those things can contextually change, but again, it requires the consensus of everyone involved. So you can't just make it a slippery slide just because it works with your argument. Yeah, Michelle, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, it's another thing where I don't have an answer. I think it depends. Maybe I wouldn't hire a neo-Nazi, but do I want him, if he's willing to engage in dialogue, do I want him there? Maybe yes. If he's willing to listen, he's not committed to changing his mind, and that's the struggle we've had, how far do we want to go with this? Who's this conversation for, and we've always said, it's Democrats, Republicans, and not everybody on our team was always comfortable with that. So it depends on, what your goal is. Who do you think needs to be in the conversation? A lot of times I've heard things that I'm not comfortable with, but I'm okay with being uncomfortable. Not everybody is. So it depends.
Yeah.
There's no answers for these things. There's really a lot of times no answers. It depends on the situation, on the particular kind of the event or situation you're trying to create, and who should be there.
I think that's a very important conclusion, Michelle, because I feel like a lot of folks think there has to be an answer at the end of it. There has to be some solution that fixes everything. There's some large blanket that we can just like share out and it'll cover every issue that we need to get covered. And the fact of the matter is context and nuance matters. So that means that the answers are always going to change. The solutions are always going to look different with every community and individual in mind. So that's, I think, a really important thing that people should be leaving with. So I appreciate that a lot. I'm noticing a couple of folks are asking questions and raising their hands. So I think now might be a really good time to loop them into the space to reflect and be a part of this too. First, I saw Samira raise her hand. So I want to give my colleague, who's the multi-region coordinator for URI, a space to be able to share. Samira? Oh. Yes, sorry. I need to ask you to unmute.
Yes, you needed to ask me to unmute. Hello, everyone. And you said my name as I was entering the tunnel, so there is an option that I'm going to be cut off. Let's hope that doesn't happen. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so my reception is good, obviously. Hello, everyone. My name is Samira Tile. Thank you for giving me a chance to speak. Unfortunately, because I'm in the car, I cannot turn on my camera, but this has been I wouldn't miss this conversation for the world. And just a few reflections on what I've heard. As someone who's coming from a post-conflict country, early on in my peace-building work, I realized that there's no alternative to dialogue, and that's my only option that I have. And just like Michelle just now said that there doesn't have to be a solution at the end of the process. Another misconception about dialogue that people have that I encounter often is that it's a pleasant and enjoyable experience overall. And rarely it's a pleasurable and enjoying process, because if you have to engage about like heavy loaded topic with emotions and trauma and stress, it's not going to be a positive experience or a bloomy kind of rose gold process that everyone's going to enjoy. So that's a misconception that a lot of people have when coming to a place of dialogue. Another issue that possibly, sorry, there's an ambulance behind me and I need to do something. I'm going to stop here. Oh, sorry, this was really an uncomfortable situation. Anyways, another issue that can happen is having a dialogue in our own echo chamber. And that's a problem that a lot of like people that I work with encounter, because it's easy to have a dialogue in an echo chamber where everyone sounds exactly the same. And so how to extend this place of dialogue into with people that essentially disagree with you. So this is what I wanted to contribute to the conversation. It has been a real pleasure to listen to everyone who was a part of the call for now. And thank you, Tahoe, for giving me the space to speak. I'm sorry because of all the distractions.
Thank you, Samira. I appreciate you sharing. Michelle, Pete, did you have any thoughts about anything that Samira had to say? All good if you don't, and all good if you do. So there's no...
just echoing what you were talking about, the echo chamber. Yeah, I mean, we have to, if we want to create dialogue, we need to decide who are we doing this for, and sometimes the echo chamber is, preaching to the choir. So if we want to expand this conversation, if we want to make this a seed of, bigger, change that will have socio-political, nationwide impact, then how do we expand it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just say, to build on what both Michelle said and Samira said, yeah, I actually think sometimes when we have people who are generally of like mind, that growth is a lot more difficult to see happen. And so I think it's actually very productive. It's more challenging, but it's more productive, I think, when you have people who are not looking at the same issue in the same way. I think it can be critical, but then getting people who don't see the same issue in the same way. I think, this is a thing that, Michelle has talked about, several times now, can be challenging to get them into this process, and, I mean, some of the more rewarding experiences I've had are when people share at the end where they think that sitting around talking to each other is like a soft, fuzzy thing, and they really don't like it. But then by the end, they see the value in it and the power in it. And so those can be really, really rewarding moments amidst, again, what Samira said, which are, yeah, these people have to do work and they have to challenge their thinking and be willing to have it challenged. And it's not easily done.
Yeah. And I think that uncomfort is the most rewarding for self-growth, like you said, to the end of the conversation. I think the times that I really felt like something inside me changed was when I was very uncomfortable with something that was said, something that really challenged me, and that's when you have your personal self-growth.
So I have a question in the chat box, and Donna, I do see your hand raised, so I'm affirming that once I get this question answered, then we can go to you. Katie Kennedy, who's on the call, mentioned something that was brought up before, and she said, this brings to mind the concept of calling in versus calling out. Is it something said out of ignorance, a teaching moment? is it someone trying to be offensive? Based on the context, what is the appropriate way to respond? And it kind of, I'm going to take the privilege of copying an answer that Michelle gave before. It depends. None of those things are going to have the same outcome. I think oftentimes when we enter these spaces, I think BIPOC folks or Black, Indigenous people of color oftentimes acknowledge that they seem like when they enter spaces where they might be engaging with folks that might be white, there's this need to enter the space and say that, well, you're privileged, so you cannot speak to this situation. And sometimes it kind of depends on how they take that approach, which can lead to something meaningful or it can lead to something destructive. Something that I actually mirrored in how I was speaking with Michelle and Pete was this idea of talking to privilege without attacking them for being privileged, while acknowledging that I am also privileged too. I had mentioned a specific space and way in which I was privileged as a male Brahmin, which was able to connect in ways that Michelle and Pete were able to share about privileges in certain spaces. And it's all about the approach in the way that you inspire that in a conversation. The more combative you are in trying to address the problem, the more it's going to turn into a debate. But the more you're inviting people to acknowledge things, to deconstruct things, to analyze things more deeply, the more you're actually going to be able to get some conversation and consensus in the long run. Peter, Michelle, I don't know if you wanted to share something.
Yeah,
I could. Oh, sorry. I had.
No, go ahead, Michelle.
I couldn't agree more. I've seen a lot of debate about calling in versus calling out, and I don't have any links or anything, but there is research about calling out being unproductive, and there was some research that said that some trainings where people felt like they are being called out ended up getting like the opposite results of what they were aiming to get. So I'm all into calling in and making people feel comfortable and wanting to share and wanting to go through the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to just share my screen really quickly because this conversation made me think of something that we did a while ago, if everyone can see what I'm sharing. So we had, the idea about like that idea about calling in, calling out, a lot depends on like you, right? And like how you feel, how you assess situations. And it was interesting because we were working with a group, and there was a time where there was, you might remember there were some bombings in Paris several years ago now. And there were posters that were put up in the Paris metro. And so, the idea that there might be ways that we could move into a uncomfortable situation that were fundamentally non-confrontational, just depending on who you were and your comfort. And I remember seeing this poster, and it was done as like a cartoon, and it came from the Middle Eastern feminist. And the idea was this big man berating a woman in hijab, and another woman going up and really just say, basically saying, wow, I love your scarf. Would you come and sit with me? And the idea was to be an ally, to ignore the big person yelling, but to be with them and give them comfort. And so it was interesting. And the other types of confrontation are, addressing behavior, setting limits, questioning, appealing to principles, educating. That comes from teaching tolerance. And what we had done was really nothing more than try to synthesize and maybe create a little bit more of a continuum. But the idea was assessing you and yourself and first, and your levels of kind of comfort. Do you know the person? Do you not know them? What do they look like? What are your surroundings? Are you better off calling? So that echoes, I think, all of what has been said before, but I think it also echoes a lot of what Michelle said around it depends, right?
Yeah, definitely. And Pete, I would love for you to share that with me so I can share it with participants as a follow-up.
I will.
I would say there is one exception where I would not, agree with not calling out. The one exception is when there is powerful leadership involved. I think at times when you have the power to change things, but you choose not to, there's a certain point to where I think dialogue may not be, the first thought that comes to mind and engaging, but there's also not a reciprocity of willingness to be able to engage in dialogue because the person in power is not willing to go forward. I think that is a good time to be able to use something like calling out because that's where accountability comes in. Accountability is also a very central part to how dialogue works because you're trying to uplift and empower each other in a shared equal space, right? But if someone in power is not allowing you to do that because they're in a place of privilege that you cannot access, then that's one of the few times where I think calling out does work. And there are multiple ways of doing it in a shared community context. It can look like all of the typical ways of, either doing things on social media, writing up petitions, being able to speak up in large mass movements and stuff like that. That's where I feel that kind of accountability can be had. But oftentimes I would agree that calling in is definitely better than calling out. Donna, I want to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all, first of all, for a really rich, thought-provoking conversation. I take part in so many of these virtual gatherings, and this is one of the ones that I will take a lot more from. First of all, a bit of an anecdote, a bit of storytelling on this whole business of calling in, calling out, because I saw Katie's remark and it made me think of something very specific. So I want to share that with all of you. And then a couple of questions arising from a problem that I'm struggling with. And for perspective, I'm calling from west coast of north of the 49th. So my comments are North American wide applicable, I think. Calling and calling out this past, and I'm here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. This past summer, it was announced at our, I'm part of Christchurch Cathedral, Anglican, but Episcopalian in north and south of the 49th community. And it was announced that it was going to be a summer long with just 3 or 4 sessions, book club focused on white fragility, the book that we're all familiar with probably. And it was a book that I was planning to read on my to-do list. And I thought, oh, what a great opportunity. There's a group that's going to gather. We have something in common. We can all discuss this. However, I was totally gobsmacked when in the announcement and description, it said for white women only. And I'm going, what? How can you want to have a discussion and about white fragility, the book, and you're limiting it to white women only. So I called out on it. I went to the person who was organizing it, who was the vicar of the cathedral, and I said, who's a woman, who is white? And I said, how can you do this? I mean, grant you, the majority of this particular congregation and many congregations is dominantly white and dominantly women, okay? Nevertheless, you're going to talk about racism and you're excluding anybody who is non-white. This doesn't work. This totally doesn't work. We had a really good long hour conversation about this, at the end of which very open, very honest, very overused word, transparent, mutually. At the end of which I kind of cheekily said, you know what? I think the solution to this is, why don't I start a parallel club for the same number of sessions, but excluding white women. In other words, all the rest of us who want to talk about this will get together just the way you guys are, you gals are. And maybe for that last session, we could all get together and see where we're at, right? And I was being a bit facetious. I was being a bit cheeky. I acknowledged it and I smiled, right? But after a day or two, she got back in touch with me and she said, you know, thank you so much. Thank you so much for, she didn't use the word, but calling me out on this. She explained to me the reason. You don't have to know that. But anyway, the reason why she did this, which was, well, I'll tell you, it was like, well, and it wasn't just her decision alone. She took it to the trustees. They had a committee-wide discussion about how this book club might work. And it was thought that it might be more freeing or liberating for them to only talk this amongst themselves. I know the dynamic, I understand it, but nevertheless, she said, you know, after thinking about this, I just decided we're going to change the parameters. It's open to everybody. Gender, no gender biases, no race biases. And would you co-facilitate this with me? And that was kind of an interesting dynamic. We did it. So that's my little anecdote about that in terms of speaking out, even on a microcosm level, never mind taking out banners and, and marching, but just on a day-to-day microcosm level. The problem and the question I'd like to hear some feedback on is one grown out of frustration, personal, and huge concern. I am Chinese. I am first generation Canadian, born in Montreal, actually. The frustration is, since I was very, very young, and I'm getting very, very old, but since I was very, very young, I've always been interested in others than myself. And I have to say, thinking deeply about what happened a few nights ago in Georgia and about my life here in Canada. And I say this, I think, with pretty wide eyes, that I've been very fortunate. You use the word privilege, that actually in my growing up here and living in various parts of our country, I have never been the direct subject of discrimination. My parents, not so. My grandparents, absolutely not so. But that's what I'm living, okay? So being, though, interested in other cultures, other religions, as we all are in this kind of self-selected group of people involved with URI, we're open to things. Now, and so I belong to groups. I'm part of URI. I'm part of a multi-faith ecumenical committee here. All of these kinds of things, and we talk and we dialogue amongst ourselves, sort of like the White Women Only Fragility Club. We talk amongst ourselves. Okay. Yet, in all of these years and all of these participations and involvements and organizing, we're faced with the fact that intolerance, phobia of religions and races doesn't seem to be getting any better. We're not seeming to, I mean, what happened the other night? I mean, you know, I'm watching American television, I'm watching MSNBC, and we're dissecting, well, you know, maybe it wasn't racist, maybe it was just, you know, his sexuality, all of this kind of thing. And we talk and we talk and we talk. I think in terms of, here's my question, what is the problem? How do we solve problems unless we can identify the problem? And the problem of intolerance, phobias, what causes this in the human being? I mean, this is a simplistic question, but I don't know how we can actually solve these problems and keep talking and talking about them amongst us, we who are deeply concerned or activists, what at the bottom of it causes it. I've been thinking this through, and it's, yes, it's fear, it's ignorance, it's all these things we all talk about. It's superiority. Is it a desire for each and every one of us to have some sort of privilege? And we just got to, we put down others who are threatening our potential privilege. I don't know, but I really would love to be directed to whatever that can give me some insight into that fundamental problem, which if we can't address that, we can keep talking for me the rest of my life and maybe never get, and still be confronted with the kind of events of 9/11, the aftermath of the other night in Georgia, and the aftermath of all of that. So I'd love to hear some feedback.
Donna, thank you a million times over for sharing your personal story, for sharing your thoughts and concerns, and for bringing up that question. I think you're asking the question of all questions, which is a process. It's something that remains unanswered. It has a lot of I don't knows attached to it. But I think you're inviting us into something really important to think about when we're talking about the very nuanced approach of addressing injustice and hatred and ignorance. And since that seems to be, a part of a much larger conversation in the grand scheme, Pete, Michelle, this might be something to consider as a part of a longer dialogue process in URI that maybe we can consider putting together if each of us has the bandwidth to do so, to really break down this idea of, what Donna is bringing into the space. And two, to the point of your anecdote, Donna, you've kind of answered a bit of your own questions there, I would argue. The act that you did in actually calling out someone in power again, as I was speaking to before, by making them think about what they're doing and the implications that it has, rather than just merely attacking them with a character flaw, it was, I think, a very powerful point that you made, which led to the invitation to you about co-facilitation. Oftentimes when people come together in those shared spaces or committees to talk in their own echo chambers, since they don't get outer perspectives about things that they should be thinking about, that means they come up with the idea without the context of seeing how the world might look at it. They see it as a good idea. They see themselves going forward with it, yet they don't want to just take a step back and be like, what might others think about it? As much as they want to gather in their own space, they could have thought about having listening sessions with other women of color to complement their conversations. They easily could have thought about, case studies in which they need to literally challenge their white fragility as they're reading the book from Robin DiAngelo to really take a step into some uncomfortable spaces themselves by hearing from women that might, share some perspectives that they need to hear. One of the things that they did end up doing was having someone like you, among others, be a part of the co-facilitation process. And I think most importantly, I think it was really important to offer a counter in certain spaces to say, we're also actually going to have a space for women of color to be able to talk about this kind of stuff too. Because there are certain points where intersectional justice needs to be met with a lot of, these kinds of restorative spaces to be able to think about, to reflect, and to really answer the deeper questions that you have in mind as to the source of why this stuff is happening and how we can fix it. And I want to pass it to Pete and Michelle to share their perspectives.
Michelle, would you like to, or should I?
I think Dahil covered it. I mean, it is a much bigger conversation. I think it's a part B.
I guess I think that both Michelle and Tahil have answered it well, but I wanted to maybe venture a different thought in response to what Donna said, which is that, you know, I'm just a person more on the ground, like involved in these circles and doing these. I think I've done like, now it's been like 12 different dialogues in the last 5 months, something like that. And I think through the lens of media, I think is the challenge that I have, because I see a lot of hope in Central New York. Just that's the area that I'm in, because what I've seen from last summer, you know, the events of the following, you know, the killing of, you know, George Floyd, you know, and Black Lives Matter. I've seen evidence of like a sea change in terms of how communities and institutions and organizations have been thinking, and that evidence is seeing how again, like I've been surprised to see the number of businesses and schools and colleges and everyone who not only are coming out with statements, but are actually doing elements of accessibility and inclusion and diversity and work that I don't think they had ever done before. So I see words, which are really just words. They're important, but I also see action from that. You know, I see, you know, in 2 years' time, I've seen an amazing growth in diversity committees, chief diversity officers. These are new things that are happening, and I'm mindful of the pitfalls of that, but I'm also looking at that with a lot of hope and a lot of energy as well around, and what school districts are doing, and what, you know, just again, that's in my own little slice of the world here, and you're all in different slices of the world, maybe bigger. But I see a lot of hope in that. And those are the types of things that don't get picked up in the media. They're not juicy stories, but those are the things that, I guess, as a person who's more grassroots on the ground, that's the story that I see. And I guess I think, Donna, your points are so excellent and so well taken, and I think really deserve a whole session unto themselves. But I also want to offer, I don't know if there's hope there or not for you all. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But I guess I see a lot of people who are not only trying to talk, but act differently, and feeling like they're stuck, but at least recognizing that they're stuck, but they want to go somewhere. And so I feel like there's hope too. So for whatever that's worth.
And Donna, to add to Pete's point, I'm gonna leave my email in the chat box, and I'm gonna make a commitment to you. And since this is live and being recorded, I have to hold myself to this. That's how accountability works. Please email me, and let's see if we can actually start a dialogue. I want to take your advice and your ability to engage with this seriously. And I want to invite everyone on this call and watching live to be able to be a part of this too, if they're interested. Because these kinds of spaces to talk about these kinds of things are very important. And we oftentimes in these conversations kind of leave out, you know, the experiences and the perspectives of what might be happening in Canada, because in North America, we are very US centric. So I want to be able to invite that opportunity to engage in something much deeper and, you know, multilateral.
Well, just a footnote to all of this. Yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, or was it, anyway, 24, 48 hours ago. And somebody sent me a beautiful musical celebration from Ireland, 300 voices, musicians, dancers, etc. And it went on for about 2, 3, 4 minutes. And I went, wow, Ireland is so diverse. I mean, it sounds crazy, but I think of Ireland as green and white, green, you know, shamrocks and white people, right? And love them and love all that they do and all their music and all their writings and everything. But we live in a diverse world now, cliche though may be, North America, whatever. We have to be able to know how to deal with these things because we're everywhere. Everybody is everywhere. And we're not in our isolated whatever villages anymore. So yeah, I just hope these words that we're all saying every other sentence of diversity, inclusion, all of these words produce actions like you're speaking of, Pete, from small communities to larger countries. That's all.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I would just say that our work has shifted to follow. People are doing racial equity strategic planning. How do we embed a new racial equity lens into the way we operate and function? We've been incorporating it's been, for groups that are ready and able to talk about it and they're out there. We talk about what are the patterns of the way white people communicate, and how does that layer into ways that we think what we do in ways that may, and so it's, I don't know, I just find it very exciting. I think there's a lot of excitement out there. And I think this is what I'm seeing on the ground in central New York and in Syracuse. And so I think I see a lot of promise and what's happening here. And I hope those things are happening not only where you're at, Donna, up in Montreal, which is such a beautiful city, but in all the spaces where you are all at, participating in this call.
I believe she's in Vancouver, if I'm not
Oh,
mistaken.
sorry, I apologize, Vancouver. Also a beautiful city.
Yes.
Just one other comment. Indigenous people say that here in Canada, we've been directly grappling with and addressing our historical maltreatment of Indigenous peoples. Truth and Reconciliation is the process. Learning from that Indigenous peoples say it takes 7 generations to work a problem out, okay? I grew up with the improbable, absurd assumption on my parents' part that I would marry a Chinese person. Absurd because they chose to raise us in a neighborhood in an area of Vancouver. I'm in Vancouver now, not Montreal, but anyway, I love Montreal too, where we were the only Chinese family. No, there were 2 Chinese families, and the other family had 3 girls. So the probability of my ever meeting and marrying a Chinese person was absurd. Nevertheless, I'm the eldest of 4, and none of us ended up marrying Chinese, okay, period. And just circumstantially, no racial biases here, but just circumstantially. And my son, who is half Chinese and half Italian Canadian, now has 3 beautiful children who are part Norwegian, part English, part Chinese, and part Italian. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's going to take generations for us to get this together. That's all.
One of my colleagues who's on the Leadership Council of North America shared a very important sentence to reflect on that I think speaks directly to that point, Donna. He said that I may not be able to see change or reform in my lifetime, but I know that it will be change and reform that happens in my lifeline. Which means that generational nature of, being able to see better days come may not be something we see, in the near future, but we know that we're contributing to the work that's going to lead to that lasting change. And I think, where each of us should be doing the most that we can in that process, whether it starts at the spaces of dialogue and manifests into the work that we need on the ground to protect and uplift, to share solidarity, to change legislation, and to change those sociocultural norms that inhibit us from actually living in a peaceful world. I think that change is coming slowly but surely, but we have to take it for the value of each step that it takes going in a positive direction. Katie, Linda, I know you both have been on the call as strong people listening in. I want to invite you to share anything if you'd like. Just make this space yours as it's been for everyone else. Oh, yes, and I need to unmute you, which is my mistake.
Thank you for the invitation, Tayo. I was smiling to all of you when Donna was speaking, as a Slovak married to a Sicilian Neapolitan whose daughter married a Jew 5 years ago, and who feels who's now has an interfaith family, living in and as a Catholic, living in a area of the country that is predominantly Christian, but not necessarily, but Catholics are a very small minority here, and Jewish and our Muslim siblings are also in a very small minority. I happen to be one of the leader right now, one of the leaders of our cooperation circle. And in terms of interfaith dialogue, we have had an instance recently where we engaged in a internal discussion with respect to our member of our circle who's with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so it really was an intra-faith dialogue within the Christian faith that was tricky for us in a way, but I think we've come to an understanding that the question had been: is there room within, and Tahil, I think your ears might perk up on this, is there room within URI for conservatives? Because as Donna was saying, those of us within URI, we're kind of almost self-selected in a way. Where I grew up in New York and New Jersey, multi-faith, multilingual, multicultural environment. And all this, all that was natural to me. And so becoming a member of URI and, working together with other people of different faiths, different cultures, was all quite natural. We had this question, though, arise within our circle about whether there was room for people who were conservatives, not only, especially political conservatives, considered themselves political conservatives. And the resolution was that, yes, of course. And thank you for expressing your concerns. But I still feel a little bit of tension within our circle. But most recently, I'll tell you, it's been, like I said, intra-faith is an I think with respect to racial issues, is where we're at here in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, which is our region of Appalachia. And because we've had an instance after the Martin Luther King celebrations recently where one of my friends received a letter from a veteran who basically berated Martin Luther King Jr. and called people in the Black Lives Matter movement varmints. And she's a woman, she's a Black woman. And so we're at the same time calling himself Christian in this veterans ministry. So we continue to struggle and in this latest instance, which by the way we're dealing with contemporaneously right now. The woman who received this letter is meeting with the police shortly about his and he sent along a picture of his Confederate flag, and included in the letter a discussion of how his veteran buddies came by with with their 45s when there was a march, a Black Lives Matter demonstration nearby. Anyway, that's why I say that there's and I also participate with and am a leader in Tennessee with the Poor People's Campaign, which, as you know, is called a National Call for Moral Revival. And so there's this question, really, whose morality? These people, within the Christian faith, and then this goes back to what I was saying about our Latter-day Saints members, that, and this struck me what Michelle was talking about earlier about the book of Exodus, this, having a dialogue about a certain chapter of the Bible. And back to what I was about to say about the Poor People's Campaign. It came up not too long ago. Reference was made to a book in the New Testament. So, like I said, I'm Catholic, but I was just raised Catholic, so I don't claim to have any kind of handle on the Bible. Really, it's a failing of mine. But anyway, so I looked it up, James 5, I think it was. But while I was on Bible Gateway, I looked at the different translations and because we had recently had this question with respect to our Mormon friends, I looked at the Latter-day Saints translation. And the interpretations are stunningly different. They were this, and don't trust my memory that it was James 5, but anyway. So we're dealing, in our American landscape now that we're dealing with, and probably might be true in Canada too, I don't know, that we're not all working from the same set of facts. Where it used to be when I was young, and this was before Kyle's time probably, there were 4 or 5 stations on TV, and there was ABC, CBS, NBC News, and we all were served up pretty much the same set of facts. Now we're not even working from, it seems to me, we're not even working from the same even mildly similar translations of the Bible. It's a very difficult situation that we're in right now. I believe that Pete is right, that there is a new understanding that's being advanced, and that's good. That's good and a belief and in the rights that everyone has a right to live. We've seen an ugly, in Atlanta. But with respect to when I was hearing Peter's recognition of that fact that we are moving forward after George Floyd's murder, God rest his soul, that on the other hand, we heard the police officer in Atlanta say that the murderer was having a bad day. So back to Tyle's point about acceptance and tolerance, that's a situation of we need not to tolerate. We need not to we need to call out police officers who say that a white guy who blows away 8 people is having a bad day. We need to call that out. So, but anyway, I'm sorry to keep you, but thank you. Those are the challenges that are going on in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia right now. Thank you.
Linda, many thanks for sharing your perspectives, your experience, and calling into the space. A lot of the reminders that we need when it comes to the never-ending challenges of the work that we're doing. It's very clear that in every space, from the busiest metropolitan cities like Los Angeles and New York City to places like northeastern Tennessee and Virginia, to from sea to shining sea, we are facing these issues. And we don't want to set ourselves up for failure, acknowledging that we keep looking at these issues, we keep dialoguing about them, and that's where it remains. But dialoguing is a very central part to how we need to go forward, because like it's been brought up time and time again, there are limitations to the approach that we have and the ability to engage in conversations with people who are not really willing to engage in conversations with us either. These difficulties and these challenges are a part of the evolving process of what solidarity is supposed to be, which is more responsible, which is more intersectional, and which is breathing new life into our ability to work with one another. And it's going to keep being that process. I mean, I don't foresee it being any easier than it already is right now, because it's not easy now either. But I don't think that should be a deterrent. I think that should inspire us to a further commitment in why we do this work. And so I really want to appreciate you bringing that into the space. I kind of want to wrap up in the next couple of minutes because of that. So Michelle, Pete, if you have any last words that you'd like to reflect on, I'd love to invite you to do so.
I think my last words were what I tried to say earlier around I think it's like we can see a lot of challenge, and there is a lot of challenge, but I think where I would go back to is I was also trying to point out, how do we see hope, and how do we see where there is movement and where there is change? And so I want to, it's both, right? Both and rather than either or is, and so there is a lot of challenge in this work for sure. And there's also a lot of hope in it. And, I like both.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. embrace the discomfort, lean into the discomfort. I think that's the important thing, to convince everybody that it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to be, it's not something to be angry about. Embrace it.
Definitely some positive words from both of you. And thank you both so much for bringing the wealth of insight that we needed to hear from people. And most importantly, inspiring even our own participants to be able to speak their truths into this space. I think it speaks to the comfort and the discomfort that you both have invited to be able to share. And I just want to be able to thank you on behalf of myself personally and on behalf of URI North America, because it is the work of all of you as participants in cooperation circles that make this work for the interfaith movement anywhere near possible. And for anyone tuning in from Facebook and around Zoom, thank you all so much for taking part, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend.